watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Your host, Michael. We are going to be discussing Professor Weidenkopf's book with him, who's going to be, right now he's backstage. I'm going to be bringing him on here in just a moment. But the book is Light from Darkness. 9 times the Catholic Church was in turmoil and came out stronger than before. A very welcome and timely book right now when there are just so many people who are tempted to despair and even leave the Catholic Church. So this is a really fitting book for our time, and I'm excited to interview him here in just a moment. But just to briefly introduce him, for those of y'all who are not familiar, he is a professor at Christendom Graduate School. In fact, he's a former professor of mine, and yes, he was awesome. I took his class on the Crusades, which I love. And by the way, check out his book on the Crusades. I'll put a link to it in the description after this post live. But he has taught, like I said, at Christendom, been featured many times on Catholic Answers, and is the author of multiple books. But again, we're going to be discussing Light from Darkness, and I put a link to it in the description if you want to go ahead and check out a copy of it on Amazon. All right, bringing him up, coming up next. Professor, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Good, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show again. Good to see you. How you been?
Been doing pretty good. I'm finally, well, at least technically, today is the last day of my quarantine. I've been dealing with the coronavirus lately, so getting back into the swing of things. But if you hear me cough or something like that, that's why. But other than that, I've been doing pretty good. How about yourself?
Yeah, doing well. Staying healthy. So that's good. Sorry to hear about your bout with coronavirus, with COVID,
Yeah.
the recent yuckiness. So I'm glad you're doing better, though.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad to be getting back into the swing of things, though. So, like I said, what we're doing is discussing your book, Light from Darkness. As I said, this is an extremely timely book because, like I mentioned, there are quite a few people that I talk to and just encounter on a daily basis that are confused with what's going on right now in the Catholic Church. They recognize that there's a crisis and they don't know how to respond to it. And some of the people are thinking about leaving Catholicism and going elsewhere, to Eastern Orthodoxy especially, or they have already done so, or they're at least considering it. And I think that what you do in this book is you address other times in church history where there were times of turmoil and crisis, and what the proper response at that time was and how it applies to today. So I'm really excited about talking about this book. Let me just ask you, I imagine I know why you wrote the book, but I'll let you answer. Just generally speaking, what motivated you to write this?
Yeah, great question. And I kind of addressed that at least a little bit in the introduction of the book. And it really is a book that has come about over the last couple of years in, my mind, at least in seed form, if you will, germinating for a period of time. And the genesis really came from just going around teaching, giving talks at parishes and various conferences and and invariably I would always get asked the question, rarely did I never get asked this question, basically. But the question, it was, simply from, someone from the audience of, have we, things are so bad in the church right now with the sex abuse crisis, with, clerical corruption, immorality, lack of faith or loss of faith, things in the modern world, a post-Christian society we live in the West. You keep listing all the things on the list, right? Or naming all the things on the list. And people would say, has there ever been a time in church history as bad as it is now? And that always gave me pause because, as a teacher of church history, someone steeped in church history, my immediate response in my brain when someone asked me that question was, well, no, it's not, it's not as bad, now is not as bad as it has been. There've been worse times in the church's history where things were significantly worse than they are now. But I began to wrestle with that question, and why are people asking this question? And I think it came down to it. Really, I answered it from interacting with people and thinking about it in a way that, in two ways, really. One was, people kind of lack, or a number of Catholics, right? Average Catholic, I think, tends to lack an understanding, or at least a deep understanding, of church history. And that's not a fault of their own necessarily. I think that the church, in many ways, over the last generation plus, has not done as good a job as she could have in teaching people church history. There's been, and I've talked about this before in various other books, and maybe even on the show here, that there's been a lot of emphasis over the last number of years of teaching Catholics and catechetics and whatnot for sacramental prep. A lot of focus on Scripture, all of which is good and important and necessary, but there hasn't really been a concomitant focus on teaching church history. And so I think the average Catholic really wrestles with an understanding of history, and that's been part of my life's work over the last couple of years, frankly, is to try to change that, right? Is to give people a better sense of their history. So that's one answer of why people ask that question. And the other answer, I think, is what I talk about in the introduction to the book, is that we really, in our modern society, are rooted in what I call the tyranny of the present. And what I mean by that in the book and what I mean by that phrase is that modern society is so fixated on the here and now, so fixated on the current crisis, so fixated on the 30-second soundbite, the constant 24-hour, 7 days a week news cycle, that we are and our cell phones and this and that and all these great technology we have, but we're really rooted in the present. And we have lost a sense of historical perspective. And so I think that's why we think, another interviewer said to me about the book when we were talking about it, said, she hates the phrase or the word unprecedented, right? It seems like we hear that almost every day. We're living in unprecedented times, or this is an unprecedented crisis, or an unprecedented, military disaster, whatever. I mean, there's, and that word gets thrown around. And I think, our media that uses it so frequently or whatever, it loses its sense. We lose our sense of perspective as a result of it. So that's another reason why I wrote the book, was to try to give Catholics not only just a general knowledge of the times when things were bad in the church, maybe worse and definitely worse than they are now in certain circumstances, but also to help us regain our historical perspective. And not only to just talk about the times that were worse, if you will, or bad crises in the church's history, but to illustrate, which is the main point of my book, is that whenever there has been a crisis in church history, that has always produced reform and renewal. Hence the title of the book, Light from Darkness. And so it's also to give a sense of hope to Catholics who, as you mentioned, may be experiencing some level of anxiety about the church in the modern world.
I've heard people say that, okay, well, yeah, there have been times in the past, and we're going to look at some specifics in the book here in just a moment, but they'll say, yeah, there have been times in the past that were really rough, but what we're experiencing today is, a combination of all of those issues in the past all at once. This isn't just the time of the Arian crisis where you have heresy. We not only have that, but it's also like, similar to other periods in history where there's a lot of clerical scandal, for example. So they'll say that there's all of these different things that we've seen bits and pieces of historically in the past. It's all happening together at once. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, I mean, I understand that perspective, and I would say two things. One, I would say, well, are we sure that this is the only time in church history when there's been a multitude of different things happening all at once? I would tend to argue no. I think you can point to other periods of church history where there have been a multitude of problems and a multitude of crises ongoing at the same time. Perhaps the argument that we are living in a Western post-Christian world that has been catechized or had been catechized and evangelized and now has rejected the faith. That seems to be a bit of a new, historical situation than what the church has dealt with in the past. So that definitely is a new thing. But I would again argue that, in these other crises and other times, there has been a multitude of factors at play. And I think the other perspective or the other thought to it is that we happen to know about it, right? In our day and age, we happen to know that all these things are going on, right? Because of what I just mentioned, we have social media, we have the 24-hour news cycle, we have all this access to technology, which previous generations of Catholics did not have. And it's not to say that previous Catholics didn't know in centuries past, in the 11th century, let's say, for example, that there was clerical sexual immorality and corruption. Yeah, they did.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them did. Many probably did not have any idea, nor did they really ultimately care, because they were more focused on their daily life and, what was immediate to them, and providing for themselves and their families and whatnot. But yeah, I'm sure that, people talk and news got around and they heard these things in their towns and villages, just like we do. But I think our access to the technology and our access to the knowledge of things happening gives us a heightened sense that things are way worse than they've ever been. And I just don't think that that's a proper perspective for us to have.
Well said. Now, one of the first things that you address in the book is the issue of the lapsy, some of the controversies involved with the development of the penitential system, scandals from the Thurificati and Sacrificati and people or figures like that. If you could maybe talk about, who were these people? Who were the Thurificati and Sacrificati? And what does this have to do with the lapsy? What all was going on at that time, and how does it relate to today?
Yeah, sure. So basically, that's the very first chapter really of the book that I look at. The first major crisis is this time period in the early church's history, the first several centuries, when you begin to have Roman persecution, right? I mean, the very first persecution begins early on in the church's history in the year 64 with the local Neronian persecution around Rome. But then we have these series of ultimately 12 major persecutions over the next several hundred years, all the way up until the legalization of the faith under Constantine in 313. And so as the church goes through these different cycles of persecution, they have a big question that erupts from these crises and from these persecutions. And the big question is, what do you do with people who gave in during the persecution and now want to come back to the church, right? That's the central question. And so this really kind of comes to fore in the middle of the 3rd century when you have the edict from Decius. Decius sends out this edict that requires every man, woman, and child in the empire to sacrifice to the pagan gods, and then to receive a libellus, or a certificate that shows that you have sacrificed to the gods. And so you have many Catholics during this time who give in, including bishops. They sacrifice. Or you have wealthy Christians who they don't personally sacrifice, but they send their servant or their slave, or they pay someone to go sacrifice on their behalf and get the libellus in their name. And so they think they're somehow different than the Sacrificati, the ones who actually sacrificed. They can step back and say, well, I didn't personally sacrifice, but somebody did in my name, and I just have the certificate so that I don't get harassed and persecuted and killed by the government. And so that poses, so that now what happens is when persecution ends, and these people who had given in various forms, they lapsed. They were known as the lapsi. Now they want to come back into the church and want to be readmitted into communion and to receive the sacraments. And then so you have a question. That question in the church is, what do we do with them? And you have really 3 different camps that arise or develop in the church over how to answer that question. And the 3 camps are the rigorists, the laxists, and then what I would call the moderates, if you will. And so the rigorists are people who said, no way, shape, or form can these lapsi come back into communion. They gave in. I didn't. I was tortured. My family was killed. I was maimed. People I knew and loved were killed. They held fast. And now these people, when everything is peaceful, they want to come back. So no, no matter if no amount of penance would be sufficient for them to come into the church or to be readmitted to communion. There was a group of people that believe that. I mean, even we have the first papal schism in church history, the first anti-pope, because of this issue, right? St. Hippolytus in the 3rd century says that. He says, these people can't come back. And so this is the group known as the rigorists. Then you have the laxists, which were people on the other side in the church that said, you know what? It was a difficult time. We can't know everyone's heart, and different people gave in for different reasons. Not everybody has the same kind of strong constitution of faith. And if, these people gave in, but now they're really truly contrite and they want to come back into the church, well, we should let them, and the penance should be minimal, if any. And so the rigorist and the laxist obviously kind of, warred with each other and debated with each other over the question. And then you had the more moderate position, which was embraced by the Roman pontiffs as well as by other bishops, including the most important bishop during this time on this issue is Saint Cyprian of Carthage. They came forth and said, it's not an either or. It's kind of a both and, really, right? There has to be some level of penance. Depending on the nature of what happened, of the lapsy, how they gave in, what they actually did, there's levels of this. And so the penance should be kind of equal to that, or there should be levels of penance. But there should be penance, there should be true contrition. And then when all that is said and done and the penance has been performed, then they can be welcomed into communion. And so it's an important crisis in church history. It's a large crisis in the early part of the church's history, but it's important how the church answers that question, right? That the church is a house of mercy for sinners, and that we shouldn't be so rigorous in our perspective that no amount of penance can ever bring someone back into communion. Neither should we be so laxist that, you don't have to do any penance, everything's fine, just say you're sorry and come back. Again, it's the middle road, the moderate position that prevails. And then that, as you mentioned, it kind of develops in the centuries. The reform or the renewal from that crisis really is this greater development of the sacrament of confession and of penance and of penitentials ultimately later as you get into the medieval period, of the Irish bringing auricular confession to the continent as well in that practice. And so it really shapes the church's understanding of penance and of confession and of reconciliation. And it was a good thing, ultimately.
Now, when it comes to that, the developments there in the penitential system, I found it interesting that you were speaking about in the book about exomologesis, which is that public confession that early Christians did. They did it in front of everybody. It wasn't auricular confession, as you mentioned there. It was in front of everybody. You had to say what your sin was. And it was usually something really, really grave, right? Murder or something like that. And of course, there were different views here, but it was generally seen as something that was allowed once in a lifetime. But as you note, there's a development there in the penitential system. Do you think that the disruption that some people experienced in that development, where it seems like, wow, we're really changing things here, and this isn't the way we've done things. Do you think the amount of disruption that people experienced at that time with this development in the penitential system would have shaken some people, maybe to the same extent that some of the developments we've seen in the post-conciliar era have shaken some people? Do you think that there's a parallel there?
Yeah, I think that's it's a good observation, and I think I would agree with that parallelism. I think something that you can definitely illustrate. And like I just mentioned, right? We had the example of Saint Hippolytus and others. So upset and angry at the church's change, if you will, and one of the major issues there, right, was, as you mentioned, with the penitentials, is Tertullian and others were saying things like, the exomologesis is something that can be done once. It can't be done for every sin. Even there was some argument about that. What sins are included, what sins aren't. And so, here along comes the Pope and other, St. Cyprian and others I mentioned, who come in and say, well, no, we can expand this process. We can include other sins. We can include the sin of lapsy or giving in, of sacrificing, these kinds of things. And it's okay. And yeah, that did shock many faithful, at the time, right, Orthodox Christians who were Catholics who were upset at that. And, I think that's a fair parallel to some of the post-conciliar things. I'm sure you're probably thinking the liturgy and other kinds of things where people get so hung up and bent out of shape on things that are important. And I don't mean to trivialize that, but definitely, again, we have to put it into perspective, and you have to trust the church ultimately in these kinds of questions. But
well put. Now, the next question that I wanted to ask concerns another section of the book where you're talking about some of the sexual deviancies that were taking place not only in the papacy, but just among the clergy as a whole. And you start to get into figures like St. Peter Damian and some of the treatises that he had to write against particular sins that were going on at the time. Can you maybe tell us what was going on at the time, and how does that compare to some of the issues that we're experiencing today?
Yeah, we're definitely dealing with a lot of the same issues there, frankly, and it's not an issue that is a one and done kind of thing. I mean, you have the whole issue surrounds, as you mentioned, clerical celibacy and some clerical sexual immorality that was ongoing, and it was something that the church has always dealt with. Frankly, it's not a necessarily a new thing, and that was one of the things that kind of most struck me when I had some conversations with people, as I mentioned earlier in the show. Going to giving talks at parishes and conferences and what, that people are shocked to learn that the sex abuse crisis that we've been experiencing in the church in the modern age, that to learn that similar things were happening in the past, including the sin of homosexuality, of sodomy, and things like this that were major issues at the time of St. Peter Damian, 11th century, as you mentioned, and even earlier, prior to him. And so the issue is, right, at the time of St. Peter Damian, 11th century, is that over time you have the political change in Western Europe at the end of the 5th century, when the Western Roman Empire collapses, and governmental authority and political authority devolves down to a more local level, to these local ethnic, Germanic, yet Roman type chieftains, military commanders, the beginning stages of what is sometimes referred to as the feudal system, or in Europe, although there's many medievalists and historians like to debate that term. But this is when you have the kind of the change and transition in European culture and European politics, and in just that whole notion and structure of the church and state in the Western part of the world. And so you have then the growth of monasteries with Saint Benedict as he comes into the picture, and you have these growth of monasteries, and over time monasteries become economic engines. They become very important to a local economy, to local lords. You have people joining monasteries, or lords putting sons into monasteries for sometimes less than pious reasons, and so there's a laxity that begins to creep into Benedictine monasticism. And so there's always reformers who come along and say, this isn't in keeping with what St. Benedict wanted. It's not in keeping with how we should act or how we should live as monks. And there's a reform movement that has to be issued. And one of the major issues during this time, as you march through these centuries up into the 11th century, is this violation of the promise of clerical celibacy. It happens not only among what was known then as secular priests, or what we would call diocesan priests, but also among monastic clergy, or even just lay brothers in the monastery. Homosexuality was a big problem. Concubinage was an issue as well. Priests either taking women, either in marriage, or just even as having concubines, fathering children with them. And this becomes a major problem, major issue. And so St. Peter in particular writes about this, and his focus was really mostly on sodomy and that problem within monasteries. And he writes a book, which later on, later centuries, the title is given to it, the Book of Gomorrah. It's not a title that he gave it, but he writes it to Pope St. Leo IX, who's Pope at the time, and encourages him to begin this monastic reform movement, to not allow sodomy to persist in monasteries, that active homosexuals should not be ordained to the priesthood. And so these are all themes that sound very familiar to modern day Catholics, because these are things that we have been dealing with, right, over the last 20 plus years, or even longer than that, really, last generation or so. And so, that becomes a problem. But the great crisis that comes out of that is this papal reform movement. As you have these different monks, it starts locally in various monasteries. Initially, Cluny is one in the south of France, is one of the major monasteries that begins this reform movement. And then as these monks from these reformed monasteries, especially Cluny, become pope, they then take this reform into a larger universal way, to the point where you have Pope St. Leo IX, the one who St. Peter Damian wrote his book to, goes on a road trip, basically. He spends most of his pontificate traveling through France and other parts of Christendom, holding local synods, removing unworthy clergy, and demanding that clerics live their promise of celibacy, and also combat simony, which was a major problem at the time, the buying and selling of church offices. And so, again, that's the whole point of the book, right, is that we see in times of darkness and times of great crisis and great turmoil, goodness comes out of it. Right? God brings good out of evil, and we see this great reform and renewal movement prosper, and the church moves into what we would term the Middle Ages, the medieval period, on a much better footing than it had been.
And this is one of the things I really like about what you do with the book, is in each chapter you don't just address the problem, but then you address, okay, well, here was the solution at that time. Here's how the church found its way outside of that turmoil, which I think is really important, because those solutions apply to us today as well. So I find it very, very helpful when it comes to that.
Yeah, no, thanks for that comment. That's exactly true. And that's, again, another reason why I wrote the book, right, is I wanted to illustrate that. I wanted to show that God brings good from evil, that light comes from darkness, that reform, renewal, restoral comes from these times of great crisis. And so therefore we, going through our own period, if you will, of crises in the church, can take solace in that, and can take hope in that. And it's not just an empty platitude, right? Or the other thing is to say is to say, or to look at the church's history and say, well, things were bad before, that's not an empty platitude. That's not the end of the story, if you will, right? There's the rest of the story is goodness comes from that. And one thing you'll see, maybe we'll talk about this as we go along, but one thing that I saw in particular as I researched and went through the book and wrote the book, and I hope comes across in the book, is that the consistent Catholic position of reform and renewal, even when it needs to occur at the highest offices in the church, always starts locally. It starts with the individual Christian, right? It starts with the individual Catholic, with you and I. You and I are called by virtue of our baptism to live our faith authentically. And if we aren't doing that, then how can we expect the larger church, if you will, to do that? How can we criticize our pastor, our bishop, the Pope, whatever, if they're doing things that may not be keeping in with the faith? If we ourselves are not rooted in a relationship with Christ, living the sacramental life, and trying to grow each day to imitate him more faithfully. And so it starts with us, right? And then from us and from that local level, it grows and then becomes universal.
Not to go too far off track because it's related to another time period, but what you just said there reminded me of the section where you briefly addressed the imitation of Christ. And I was really glad that you addressed it and some of the movements of piety that were going on at the time, because I think that we need to return to that. We need to focus on our personal sanctity. So, let's maybe talk about that era. Let's go ahead and just kind of shift gears to there. Let's get into the Western Schism. As I was reading through that section, I was reminded of how bad that period in history really was. It was rough. It was really bad. Yep. And there's a little bit of comfort in thinking, well, at least we're not going through that right now. Yeah. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about the Western Schism, what all was going on, and how does it relate to today?
Yeah, sure. So it's and it stretches even before that, right? The Great Western Schism. There's the 14th, I call it the 14th century, or it's known as the 14th century papal crisis, right? Or crises. The 14th century papacy really for 100 years here really suffers from some significant problems. It starts right early in the 14th century after the pontificate of Boniface VIII with Clement V, who moves the papal residence from Rome to Avignon. And then you have popes living in the south of France for the next 70 years. And that causes significant problems. It's not the first time we've had popes being absent from residence in Rome. It happened before that, even sometimes a bit frequently. But it was not ever something that was a permanent kind of fixture for as long as it was in Avignon. And that causes some significant problems with the secular rulers of Christendom. Many are upset, thinking the Pope is nothing more than the puppet of the French king, which is really not historically true. But still, that's the impression that was given. Great scandal. Pope is participating in the abuse known as absenteeism, a bishop not living and not residing in his own diocese. And it takes St. Catherine of Siena, who I know we'll talk about later on, to basically go to Avignon herself and demand that Pope Gregory XI come back to Rome. And he listens to her and finally does. And so everybody kind of takes a deep sigh of relief, and it takes a deep breath. Now the Pope has returned from Avignon, the south of France. He's in Rome. Hopefully he'll stay there forever. And just as an aside, could you imagine, you mentioned how, thank goodness we're not going through those times. Could you imagine if, Pope Francis tomorrow, let's say, decided that, I don't like Rome. It's hot in the summertime. It's too humid. Forget this. I'm going back and living in Argentina, right? I'm going to just go live in Buenos Aires, just have the papal residency there. I mean, Catholic Twitter, we think it's bad now. Could you imagine what would happen if that was taking place? So yeah, we are blessed at least in that regard, right? But so
I think there would be a whole bunch of converts to Benevacantism immediately overnight. So
that's very true. So at least we're not doing that, right? But so the popes come back, right, through Saint Catherine of Siena, and even Saint Bridget before her of Sweden, are demanding the popes come back and encouraging them to. And so they come back. and Gregory the 11th, and he dies shortly after returning to Rome. And then the Roman people obviously are upset. They want to make sure that the French, or the cardinals, most of them are still French, who are gathered in Rome in the conclave, elect an Italian, because they don't want the papacy to move back, obviously, to France. They want it to stay in Rome. And so they elect Urban VI, and he's an Italian. He's not from Rome. He's from the south of Italy, but it's fine. The Romans were happy with that. And Urban VI was a reform-minded cleric. He recognized that there were problems in the church, these different issues: absenteeism, nepotism, even simony, all the things that the church had been wrestling with. And so he wanted to stop that, but he was a little bit too heavy-handed in how he dealt with his cardinals. And again, the majority of them are French. And so a few months after his election, most of the cardinals, not all of them, but most of them who elected him, gather together, and they decide that his election was null and void. They were forced into electing him by the Roman people because the Roman people were clamoring for an Italian. And they declare his election to the papacy null and void, which they had no authority to do whatsoever. And they decide then to elect an anti-pope. And he is French. And so he actually raises an army and tries to kick out Urban VI from Rome. He fails, and then ultimately he flees and goes back to Avignon. So now here we're situating we have two men claiming to be pope, one in Rome and one in Avignon. Later on, as you get into the 15th century, we'll have three men claiming to be pope. When cardinals from both sides, Rome and Avignon, gather together in Pisa, they try to solve the issue by supposedly deposing both the anti-pope and the real pope, and then they elect another pope. So now you got three guys. So it's a really confusing and difficult time in church history. And one of the things, though, that I point out, that one of the reform really that kind of comes from that is because there was so much significant problems in the papacy and other areas of the episcopacy, clergy as a whole, you have groups of Catholics throughout Christendom, but I highlight those in the Netherlands, who gather together in pious confraternities, really pious societies, lay societies, where there's not any expression of vows or any kind of taking of the evangelical counsels, but these people live in community, small or simple lives, rather, a life rooted in prayer, focused on teaching and focused on growing in personal holiness, and really living out what later on the Second Vatican Council will call the universal call to holiness, right? That's what these lay Catholics decided to do. And it spawned a great reform and renewal within the Netherlands. We have, from this group, some scholars attribute Thomas à Kempis, some doubt that, but you have the great spiritual manual, The Imitation of Christ, right, that we still read today. And so from that horrible experience, even at the highest offices of the church, you still have, Catholics who are focused on renewing the church first at the individual level, as I just mentioned, but then hopefully bringing about a larger renewal because of that focus on holiness. And so the example there for us in the modern age is, even if, our clerics are not living in accordance with the office they've been called to, not living in accordance with the great responsibility they've been given, the answer is not to reject the church, right? The answer is not to reject the sacramental life. The answer is not to even reject Christ, let's say. The answer rather is to kind of be not unaware of what's happening in the larger church, not ignore it. We're not advocating that. They didn't then either, but rather to recognize it, call for reform as appropriate, but focus internally, right? And build up the church through discipleship, through teaching, through learning, through practical living of Christian virtue.
I've mentioned this before on the show. In fact, I think I mentioned it. I mentioned on somebody else's show yesterday, but I have talked about this a little bit before. What you're saying reminds me of some advice that Bishop Schneider once gave me. I asked him, what do you do when you're just fatigued with all of the things going on in the church? There's this crisis. When you're spiritually fatigued, you're discouraged. What do you do? He said, be faithful to your baptism. And what you're speaking about there really reminds me of that personal sanctity and focusing on those things, not neglecting or pretending that nothing is going on around us, recognizing it, as you said, call for true reform, but then go inward and focus on personal sanctity and be faithful to your baptism. So I really appreciated that part of the book. Next, you talk about the Renaissance popes. Now, who were the Renaissance popes? What was going on then? How was it a crisis? And then, of course, what was the solution to the crisis?
Yeah, so the Renaissance popes, that's one of the areas of church history that most people at least have some understanding of, right, or some recognition of. Maybe
Mhm.
not as deep of an understanding as they should, but
Mhm.
most people have heard about, well, there was a time when the popes were, really not focused on being pope, that they were more interested in, beautifying Rome, if you will, or other places of Italy with these great works of art that we get to enjoy even today, of being patrons to the great artists of the time, Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, these others. And so the Renaissance popes basically were a series of 10 popes from Nicholas V all the way up until Leo X. So a span of about 75 years in church history from the 15th century all the way into the 16th century. So this is the time period we're dealing with. And in essence, what these men they were pope. They're valid popes, but they were men who were focused more on being secular lords than they were on being spiritual shepherds. That's the best way to kind of put it and to think of them, right? So to recall, right, for people who may not know, this is a time when the popes were the head of the papal states, as they're known in history. This, temporal land holdings in North Italy and Central Italy, where the popes were secular lord in essence, and had been for a long period of time since the 8th century with Pepin the Short and the donation of Pepin to create the papal states. And so, but now in the Renaissance period of time, right, these popes who come to power are focused solely on those, mostly, I shouldn't say solely, but mostly on their secular function, if you will. And so what they do is many of them, they're Italian. They want to keep the papacy, if you will, in their family. They want to increase the wealth and prestige and power and influence of their family. And so there's a significant problem of nepotism that's going on here as well, where you have, families that are popes they appoint, nephews, create nephews as cardinals, and put their relatives in important positions of authority in the curia. And so this is a real significant problem, right? Just a massive amount of corruption going on. It does, on one hand, produce some of the most beautiful works of art that we've ever seen in the world, right? With Michelangelo, Donatello, and all these different great sculptures and frescoes and paintings and buildings, right? St. Peter's as one example. But ultimately, that's a problem for the church, right? If the Pope is so focused on being a secular lord and not focused on being a spiritual shepherd, that's the wrong emphasis. That's not right. And people recognize that and knew that. And ultimately what that produces, along with, when you couple it with the 14th century papal crisis we just talked about, is what I call the Great Revolt, right? The Protestant Revolution that occurs in the 16th century, and the fracturing of Christendom within Europe and within the church. And that poses a significant problem. Obviously, something that we're still wrestling with today, right? The division of Christians and the separation into different groups. And so the reform and the renewal that comes from that period of time, right, from the papal crisis to the Renaissance popes to then the Protestant Revolution, is the authentic Catholic reform, which happens in the 16th century that's a kind of a three-pronged attack, if you will, or a three-pronged reformation. And it's a reform that focuses on the establishment of a new religious order, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. So they come into the picture at this time in church history, where Ignatius and his followers and his band of other men who grouped with him to form the society, they then form an order to really focus on catechizing, educating, defending the faith when attacked by Protestants and by heretics and whatnot. Then you see the great calling of the Council of Trent by Paul III, and how it continues on for a series of sessions over 18 years and multiple different popes, culminating ultimately in the Reformation, the Great Reformation Pope of St. Pius V, who, enacts a catechism as a result of the council, first universal catechism in the history of the church. He reforms the liturgy. He reforms the breviary, the missal, as I mentioned. So all these things, right? This reform comes out of this horrific time of just absolute corruption and scandal. And then the third prong, really, of the Catholic Reformation, if you will, is just the amount of just overwhelming numbers of fantastic saints that the Holy Spirit graces the church with during that period of time. I mean, you have great reformers in religious orders, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross. You have great catechists and teachers, St. Peter Canisius, for example. You have great missionaries at this time, St. Francis Xavier, and others, St. Philip Neri in Rome, who's providing a great example for how Catholic clergy should live and should act. And so again, really one of the most darkest times in church history, where we have for example, one of the most famous Renaissance pope, if you will, who's actively engaging in mischief with a mistress while he's pope, that's a scandal beyond all scandal, if you will, in a certain sense. But from that horrible time, right, comes this great reform, this great renewal, and this great flowering of the church, which really sets the church up in a good foundation for several centuries up until the modern world.
Hmm. Now, another era that you address is the Enlightenment. For those of us who aren't familiar with this period in history, what exactly was going on then, and what was the crisis?
Yeah, so the Enlightenment really is this phrase that's given to a group of thinkers, intellectuals in Western Europe, mostly French, a little British as well, and people from what is now the United Kingdom, right? Even some Scottish thinkers and whatnot at the time. But these were intellectuals who, because of the Protestant revolt, because of the crisis, the corruption in the church leading up to these centuries, begin to really question deeply held philosophical thought. They begin to question religious doctrine as well, and even really, most importantly, they question the placement, if you will, or the place that the church has in Western European society, and they become really enemies of the church ultimately. And not just of the church, but of religion as a whole. And anything they can do to discredit the church, anything they can do to lessen her influence in society, to create a more secular society in Europe is their goal and their function. And so these are writers like David Hume, Edward Gibbon. You have Voltaire is probably the most famous one, and from France you have Denis Diderot as well. So all these different men, they're focused on different philosophical questions, religious questions, and they, again, like I said, they take the church's history, they take her doctrine, they try to tear it apart from intellectual arguments, from philosophical arguments. Philosophy actually separated from reason, right? And a complete rejection of Catholic understanding of philosophy. And then they also, this is where we see a lot of the myths of church history that begin to crop up, myths about the Crusades, myths about the Inquisition, these myths about the early church. They begin to find their origins here in this period of time in the 16th, 17th century in Europe, when these intellectuals want to, again, discredit the church by presenting a false narrative about her historical events. And so it's a crisis because, right, these intellectuals see that the sure way that they can inculcate their ideas into European society and to really lessen the influence of the church is to get control of the universities. Not something we're familiar with in the modern world whatsoever, right? In terms of how different thought can infiltrate universities and institutions of higher learning. But this is where it stems from the Enlightenment, right? These intellectuals recognize we have to control education, we have to control the centers of higher thought and of intellectual thought, and to inculcate our narrative, if you will, into those institutions. And the way to do that is to lessen the church's influence, but more specifically, to get rid of the Society of Jesus. Because the Jesuits at the time in the 16th, 17th centuries in Europe were in control, if you will, or ran most of the major universities and colleges throughout Western Europe. And so these intellectuals clearly, especially Voltaire, clearly saw this: we need to get rid of the Jesuits. And so ultimately, sadly, they are successful in doing that. In 1773, you have Clement XIV, who actually suppresses the Society of Jesus. So the Jesuits go out of existence. They no longer exist, really, at least officially, for 40 years, right? For an entire generation. They come back later on in the 19th century. But that produces a significant intellectual problem, right? So this anti-Christian, anti-church intellectual thought pervades institutions of higher learning. It causes and brings about even earlier, or even later rather, the French Revolution. And then it produces a significant crisis for the church entering into the modern world, where you have the separation of faith and reason, the growth of skepticism or relativism. All of the things that we're dealing with in our day and age don't originate in our day and age. They originate back in this period of time. And so that's why it's very important for us to know and to recognize that. But renewal and reform comes through, a pontificate, in particular, the pontificate of Blessed Pius IX, who initiates a reform through his writings, where he calls into, where he attacks the heresy of modernism, which is one of these intellectual ideas, a heretical idea that had grown into various elements of theology and even scripture scholarship. And then he calls the First Vatican Council, which attempted, at least in one of its documents, or did in one of its documents, look at some of these intellectual arguments and discredit them, and remind the faithful that faith and reason are not separate. The faith and reason, are together and are compatible because they have as their one source God, as the author of both, and that these intellectual arguments that reason is superior to faith is not tenable and not accurate.
Now, talking about that period, modernism, you go over the issue of modernism and neo-paganism. Can you talk about some of the issues that the church experienced at that time?
Yeah, sure. So, that's kind of one of the last chapters of the book, or the last major crisis I look at in the book, is this period of modernism and neo-paganism, which is really the modern world, right? It's the era in which, the time period in which we live in. And it's a time period that is really rooted in the embracing of these, false philosophical and even theological notions of the separation of faith and reason, that, science is incompatible with faith. And we get some of these issues. I start off that chapter by talking about, the story of Galileo and whatnot, because Galileo is frequently used as the, the baton or the bat, if you will, to strike the church on the head and show how horribly anti-scientific the church is, which is completely not true from the historical record. But one of the things the church is dealing with, obviously, in the modern world is the growth of these totalitarian political ideologies as well. Right, this is the time period as we move into the 20th century of the ideologies of fascism, National Socialism, and communism, right? Things that we sadly are still dealing with in our own day and age, where the individual does not exist outside of the state. Right, these ideologies are also very utilitarian. People only have utility or worth in society, insofar as they produce something positive for society. So certain groups of so-called undesirables, or people that don't produce things, or are not in keeping, or don't agree with the governmental ideology, are not useful. And are done away with, and we've seen that, sadly, horrifically, in not too recent, distant past. And so the church is dealing with this, and that's the outgrowth of all of that. And this Enlightenment is this skepticism, this moral relativism that I talked about, and that leads to, again, people thinking, well, who is God? Is there really a God? Is there really good and evil? Is good and evil something that's objective? Is it something that's been given to us? Is it something that we can discern? Or is good and evil just something we've created? Is it a self-made human construct? And if it is, and some people believe that wholeheartedly, as we sadly know, then things that used to be considered evil, if you will, or wrong, are no longer so. Right? Marriage is not a divine institution given by God as a gift to humanity for, the good of spouses and the procreation and education of children and the flourishing of a human community. Instead, marriage is a human construct. We can make of it whatever we want. We can define it however we want, regardless of the consequences that it impacts our society, or our communities, or the church on. And so that, again, it's a major crisis. And that crisis, though, as with all things that I mentioned in the book, leads to a renewal and reform. And the reform in this era really is the growth of and the focus on the laity, really, that you see from one aspect from the Second Vatican Council with its decree on the laity, but also Lumen Gentium. The dogmatic constitution of the church talks about the laity and the universal call to holiness, as we've mentioned. And so you see this flourishing of lay Catholic apostolates. Your podcast is one great example of this, frankly, of the laity and Catholics getting involved in maintaining the faith and trying to live the virtues and encouraging others to do so through catechesis and through good example and through evangelization. And, it's a flourishing of, I think, the laity at this time. It's a good thing. And we'll see that continue to grow in the future.
Now, at the very end, you go over how to respond to the crisis and how not to respond to it. And could you maybe give us examples of both? How should we react and what should we not do?
Yeah, great. No, thanks for the question. And yeah, as you rightly pointed out, right, I end the book with this particular chapter, and I wanted to do that because it's one thing to just kind of go through these different time periods and these different historical events and illustrate them, and then show that renewal has come forth. But what I wanted to end with was a clear example, or to give clear examples of, as you mentioned, how to respond during a time of crisis and how not to. And so to do that, I kind of do a historical case study, if you will, of two different persons. Both Dominicans, living at different times, but living at times of great crisis in the church. And so I first start off with how not to respond to a time of crisis in the church. And I give the example of the 15th century Florentine Dominican Savonarola. Right, Savonarola was a man who was dedicated to the Dominican order. He was, personally, for the most part, very holy and virtuous. At least attempted to be so. Was very much focused on reform. He grew up in a family that had means to a certain extent. Lesser nobility were around the nobility in Italy, and he could see the rich and lavish lifestyle that many of the Italian families, especially the noble families, how they lived. And he rejected all that. Thought it was contrary to the gospel and contrary to the way that we were called to live as Christians. And so he became very influential. He's a great orator, great preacher, ultimately settles in Florence, and is, again, a well-respected preacher. People flock to hear his sermons, and he has great sway over the people. It's insofar really as he rails against these vanities of life, right? Jewelry and makeup and things that would highlight the self to the exclusion of community, and it brings about what we know as the bonfire of the vanities, right? Where there were groups of young men, boys, that would go around Florentine homes and who would knock on doors and go into people's homes and try to find these items of vanity. And bring them to the square where they would build these great bonfires and set them all on fire. So that's where we get that whole expression is from Savonarola. So he became very popular and very powerful. The problem with Savonarola, though, is that he is living in a time during the Renaissance papacy. Pope Alexander VI, who I mentioned earlier, is pope during this time. And he is so thoroughly annoyed and irritated and angry at the corruption that he sees throughout the church, and especially with the pope, that he, though, sadly, allows that to cloud his faith and to inculcate his faith. And so then he begins to really, he rejects the Pope. He calls Alexander the Sixth later on, a false Christ, a false Pope. He walks himself into heresy. He ultimately then enters into schism as well. And he gets himself embroiled in politics, which is a problem. Church and state rarely mix well, as we've seen throughout history. And it didn't really mix well here for Savonarola. And so ultimately he is arrested by the Florentine government and tried and executed by them. So the example of Savonarola there is, in the midst of church crisis, we need to be careful of mixing our faith with our politics. Obviously our faith should influence politics, and, we should be integrated in our approach to both elements of our life, but we can't do so to the extent where politics becomes more important than the faith, or politics outweighs our obedience and loyalty to the church. And that's what happened to Savonarola. Then on the flip side of that, if you will, the how to respond example I give is St. Catherine of Siena, right? St. Catherine, we talked about her a little bit earlier in the show. She's living at a time when the popes are living in Avignon. There's great corruption. There's clerical problems of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and other issues, nepotism. But she rails against these abuses and wants to see the church reformed, and constantly calls for the church to be reformed, constantly calls for the popes to come back to Rome. As I mentioned, she even personally went to Avignon to bring Gregory XI back. He eventually does. When you study the life of St. Catherine and you study her writings, you see that even though she was very direct, even though she was at times very poignant to the Pope, she would write letters to the Pope and in essence tell him, man up. Stop being a wuss, if you will, and leave Avignon and come back to Rome. You promised me that you would. I hear, reports that you're wavering on that decision. Fulfill your promise to me. Come back. And so she was very direct, but always obedient. And more than that, St. Catherine always was rooted in her relationship to Christ. The most important thing in her life was her relationship with Christ through the sacraments, through her prayer. And she never allowed the politics of the day, and she never allowed the church politics of the day, even more importantly, to cloud her faith or to depress her to the point where she would consider leaving the faith or leaving the church. And so she's a great saint of hope in the midst of times of turmoil and anxiety. And so I kind of leave the book in her hands, or I left the book in her hands, and then I finished the book with a discussion of her, because I think she provides a great model for us Catholics living in the modern age in our own crises to emulate.
There's a interesting question here. What signs of hope, this is by the way from Fragwagon, what signs of hope do you see today in the church, in the light of your knowledge of history?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think that one of the things I pointed out just earlier, I think in terms of the growth of lay apostolates and lay movements within the church, and how you have so many lay people who are involved not just in participating in the sacramental life of the church and in prayer, but just in growing in knowledge of the faith, right? Studying theology, studying history, studying scripture, and then wanting to be catechists and wanting to develop institutions and create institutions of higher learning, if you will, to further that, to create great content, right, that will help people grow in their faith. Great media content, podcasts like this one, books, TV shows, other faith formation type programs. There's a flourishing of that. There's whole companies that have been established to provide that to Catholics, and I think that's just a beautiful and worthwhile endeavor. I mean, hopefully, one thing we'll see, which I think has been consistent throughout church history, that maybe has wavered a bit in the modern age, although it's still present, but I would like to see it become even more so, is a return to missionary spirit, right? A missionary activity in the church. There are so many areas of the world that are still under-catechized, and there are, even more importantly, there are areas of the world that are post-catechized, if you will, right? Where I mentioned in the book, and this is not my phrase, but it's a phrase from popes. Paul VI talked about this, John Paul II, even Cardinal Sarah, as I quote in the book, talks about this, that there are so many baptized non-believers. So you have that group of people, right? People who just culturally, they baptize their children or they've been baptized themselves, but that it ends there, right? Confirmation is the end of it, if you will, if even that. And so we have a ton of people in the church, who are affiliated with the church, who are members of the church through their baptism, but have no idea what the faith is and don't live the faith on a practical daily basis. And so that's an area, I think, that especially the laity, that we can really engage in authentic discipleship and in helping people grow deeper in love with Christ and his church. And I would like to see, maybe there's a religious order on the horizon that would have a charism of ministering to post-Christian areas of the world, mostly the West, right? But that's a huge need.
Oh yeah. This one is from Hallelujah. What typically happened to Pope's kids? As soon as I read that, I thought about that part in your book where you mentioned that Niccolo Machiavelli basically wrote a book based on one of the kids of a pope. So, but yeah, what would you say? What typically happened to them?
Yeah, well, many of them. I mean, the one that you point out there, where the Machiavelli was hanging around with Cesare Borgia, who was the son of Alexander VI, and so they went marauding all throughout Italy and causing all kinds of problems for people and mayhem. So many times, right, popes or other clerics, they would have children. They either would not be recognized sometimes openly. They'd be hidden away in monasteries. I mean, that did happen. Sometimes you would have those who were publicly acknowledged, in this case with Alexander VI and Cesare, and that caused a scandal and a problem as well. Sometimes it was official recognition. Other times it was, everyone knew this was the son of the Pope or the son of a bishop or the son of a priest, but it wasn't celebrated, if you will, like it was under the pontificate of Alexander VI. So, I mean, these individuals were allowed to, live their lives as much as they could, and sometimes, who their dad was helped them into positions of power and authority and wealth, and other times it didn't. So,
Mm. Here's an edgy one. Do you think that Pope Francis is in the top 10 worst popes, top 20?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Right.
Yes, yeah, thanks
Now,
for
what are your
putting me on the
thoughts
spot.
here? Yeah.
No, yeah. Here's the deal, right? With be honest with popes. So no, I don't. I mean, he's not definitely not in the top 10 worst popes in the history of the church. I mean, you look at, from, and I cover this in the book, right, in the chapter called "A Puppet Papacy." I mean, you have for nearly 100 years here, or even a little more than 100 years actually. You have almost 200 years really. You have no canonized popes, right, from the 9th century to the 11th century, or very few, maybe two, I think, during that period of time, as I point out. And so that speaks of that tells you something, right? During that period of time, there were some significantly bad popes. John the 12th, for example, who was different accounts differ anywhere from 18 to 16 years old when he was elected pope, on the throne because of his dad basically politically manipulated people, his fellow nobles, into putting his son on the throne, who allegedly dies in bed with his mistress, who was married. So I mean, that's pretty scandalous, right? I mean, that's not
Right.
even pretty. That is scandalous. It's beyond scandal. And Pope Francis is obviously nowhere near that. Now, I
Right.
think that what we need to keep in mind, again, with the perspective, right, is I think it's hard for some Catholics to understand this pontificate because it is so different from some of the pontificates that have come before it, right? Many of us, or most of us alive at this time, right, we were alive during all or most of John Paul II's pontificate. He's within, definitely the top 10 best popes in the history of the church. And so that's a hard act to follow, right? And he was a great philosopher, great thinker. After him, you have Benedict XVI, who is perhaps one of the greatest theologians in the 20th century, definitely up there with them. And so that's a hard act to follow, if you will, both of those popes. And Francis is just different, right? He has a different personality. He comes from a different part of the world. He has a different background. He's a Jesuit. He's more focused on other, issues in the church than the previous two pontiffs. So, and it's unfortunate. It maybe goes with the job that, popes are always compared to other popes, but it is a bit unfortunate because each pontificate truly is unique. And it's unique in how it deals how the Pope interacts with other bishops, his fellow bishops, and the geopolitical world in which each Pope operates is different. And we see that changing rapidly in the modern world. So even among popes in the modern era, it's difficult to compare, if you will.
Yeah, well said. Now, this one is kind of the flip side of that question. Who's the best pope that the church has had, in your opinion?
Oh, geez, that's a hard question. I mean, so many, right? So many canonized great popes, especially those in the early church's history. I'm a medievalist at heart, and so I love the Middle Ages. And I would have to point to, I really can't limit it to one. I'd point to three or four, frankly, who I think were some of the best. And so St. Leo IX, who we talked about before, issued in one of the greatest reform movements in church history, getting rid of clerical celibacy, or getting rid of the problems that went with clerical sexual immorality and enforcing clerical celibacy, getting rid of simony. Pope St. Gregory VII, I mentioned him in one of my chapters of the book too, of the investiture controversy, the great struggle he had with King of the Germans, Henry IV, and how he maintained the political independency of the church during a difficult time. Pope Blessed Urban II, who called the First Crusade and ushered in another great reform movement in that great crusading movement, which, as you mentioned, I've written on and teach on. And so I think he's another great reform-minded pope in the church's history. And then even Innocent III, who's not canonized, but I think did a great job who gets a bad rap among many historians and other Catholics who think that he was just really focused on political power. But if you dive deeper into Innocent III's life and writings, you'll see that he was really a faithful son of the church, and who really wanted the church and Christian society to exist peacefully and to bring forth and to usher in the kingdom of God as best as he could, on earth during the time that he lived. So I think he's another great pope who did many things worthwhile for the church.
What are some of the things that you have in the works right now? I mean, I love this book, but I want to read another book. I want to read something else that you write. To be honest, everything that you write, I really enjoy. So do you have something else in the works that I can look forward to?
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, no, actually, I don't. I'm kind of at a lull in the moment for book writing. I've written a number of books over the last couple of years, so I'm a bit. I wouldn't say burned out is a strong word, but I'm definitely going to take a bit of a break here. But I think that what I do have coming along the pike is Catholic Answers. Many of your people who listen to the podcast might know that they have a new initiative they've established called the School of Apologetics, and they have a whole series of courses that they've come out with on that. And I just recently, a few months ago, taped the first church history course for them. So it's an introductory church history part 1 course, very top level overview, but I give a good number of detail in certain segments to help people walk through and understand the first 1,300 years of the church's history. And I'll go back later and tape a second course. And my hope is to develop a few more courses, mini courses on history and historical events with them. So that class, I think, will more than likely definitely come out next year in 2022. So people are interested in that, they can look for that from Catholic Answers in next year. So focus on that for right now. And go ahead.
Yeah. Well, that's from the 1st century to the 14th century that this class covers?
Correct. Yeah. And then I hope to go back in the spring of next year and tape the part 2, if you will. So
do you go into the schism with the Orthodox, in the 11th century? Do you go into that in any detail in the series? I'm just curious because I know a lot of our audience are very interested in Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I do. Yeah. I have a whole lesson on that issue, or on that historical event in this first class. So when that class comes out sometime next year, then that'll be a part of that course as well.
I want to see that. That's awesome. It sounds good, and I look forward to any future books that you'll read. We'll definitely have, or that you'll write. We'll definitely have you on for those, Lord willing, whenever they come. But once again, thank you so much for coming on and doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure, Michael. And if I could just put a shameless plug in for myself, that if anyone who wants to learn more about my books or articles and things that I've written, I do have a website. It's just my name, Steve Weidenkopf, all one word, .com. And you can go on there and find out more about what I'm doing and what I've done in the past. So I appreciate, again, the time and opportunity to come and talk about this most recent book.
Excellent. Looking forward to having you on again in the future. Once again, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks, Michael. God bless.
You too. And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll get access to extra content and support what we're doing here. Till next time, God bless.